Alright, so now we're going to move forward with working in the large definition, but before we go ahead and do that, we are going to start by getting the eyes in the eye socket here actually. And in order to do that, we're going to have to create some Z-spheres for ourselves. And before we go forward and do that, we need to bring him down a subdivision level and keep him at what we had, because if you'll notice, when we go up to the higher subdivision level here, if we tried to put the eyes in and we tried to pull the sockets and kind of clinch them in and pull them in with the move brush here, you can notice if we get in here, it's going to be very difficult to move the eyebrow and all that inside because of the resolution of the polygons. It's very high, so it's difficult to try to pull all these little small groups of polygons in when we could just take them down a subdivision level and more comfortably move the eyelids in and clinch them in a little better, because we'll be moving larger groups of polygons. So what we're going to do is jump over here to where our toolbox is, but we're going to jump in the light box to create these spheres. And just click on that. It's going to jump it right into your toolbox, and we'll start from there. Turn off light box. And right here we just have our sphere, and we're just going to take the the scale widget actually and bring it down. And we're going to scale that eyeball down because we're not going to want it as large as the default shows. So we're just going to scale it down, and we'll turn our head back on here. And we are going to need to append that new sphere into our scene with the head. So you can go down here to append and then just choose the sphere. Just like that. It's pretty easy. It's right there in your scene now. And it is obviously hidden. It's hidden behind here, so in order to see it, if you click translate, or transparent, excuse me, you'll notice that the head is transparent and there's our eye right there. So first thing we need to do is move that thing into place and turn our transparency off. As long as we have the eyeball selected, we'll be just fine. But if we just choose the move widget and make sure we got our eyeball selected, and make sure you're selecting the middle handle, because that's what actually moves it. We'll just move it into place here. We'll switch angles and move it into place forward. Right up over here. And now I think we can scale it up. If we just scale it up to a decent size at first to make sure we can turn our transparency out, we can see a little better. You can see where that eyeball is going to fit, and we'll just jump back on our move tool and kind of just nudge that into place, make sure it looks seated real good in the eye socket and that it doesn't look loose or anything like that. Just experiment with scaling and moving, and you'll get it to the right place eventually. Okay, so yeah, I think we got it to the right place now. Let's a little bit nudge this in just a little bit to look a little bit tighter. Okay, so I think we got that where we need it to be. And checking the angles one more time, and we will go ahead and move it from there, I think. Yeah, okay, so we'll go up here and we'll go back to our draw mode, or we actually in our edit mode, but in order to mirror that eye over, we're going to use the subtool master. But before we do that, we don't have to do that just right away. We already have X symmetry on for our head, so before we even go do that, We don't have to waste our time doing that just yet. Let's go ahead and shape out the brow line and the eye socket around there and make sure it all fits. And we'll have the exact same changes made on the other side, obviously, because we have X symmetry on. So just start closing in the eyelid a little more around there, and just kind of make sure it kind of semi-swallows up the eyeball there. As long as you have it real tight, and you don't want your eyeball looking like it's gonna fall out, because even if we took it down another subdivision level, it might help us shape it easier, but we'll be able to get that larger polygon group to move with our move tool and make things a little easier for us. So just keep nudging it into place. Make sure your eye doesn't lose shape though. You want your eye to keep the original shape as closely as possible. You're just kind of optimizing that shape around the eyeball. It's not a big difference in the process, but you want your eye to keep a certain shape so that it doesn't appear real blobby or anything. You have a really weird looking eye, it can really ruin a piece. So just keep the general shape that we started with. Just closing it a little more. And really just making sure it looks tight from all angles. You do want that little lip on the bottom eyebrow, or eyelid, excuse me. And then we can just kind of start lightly sculpting in the brow line and the eye socket. Now make sure you have this overlap up here. That's actually one thing that you want to keep an eye on, no pun intended, whenever you're sculpting the brow line. The overlap is pretty important because it will look a lot more accurate in the end. And we do have a little polygon issue there. That's a split polygon problem, but that's really not that big of a deal. It's just the way the polygon is split. We don't have to worry about that too much right now. We can just continue working on what we are. And we're just going to continue refining. So just a process like anything else. Make sure we close that top eyelid in. Remember, it doesn't just go brow line, eye, bottom eyelid. There is another eyelid in there, and we're going to shape that in here in a minute, but we're going to make sure that we have enough room to compensate for it first. And we're just going to slightly move a little more, make sure we have everything in place. Okay, so it looks like just a little bit more adjustment to the brow line, that little hump going. And pull it out just a little bit more. Give him a relatively menacing look here. we'll switch back to the standard and jump in here and start kind of filling this and digging it in a little bit more. And the valleys of the eyes are actually pretty important to the readability. Just another subtle feature people usually notice, because the first thing people will usually look at when they look at a piece is the eyes. It's just a natural thing to immediately look at the eyes, so the first thing they're going to notice is the problems or the progress around it, and that's just part of any piece, really, any human-like piece anyway. So we start sculpting in the socket itself, and if you know a little bit about anatomy at least, you'll know about the skull and how the sockets go around like that, but the skin around it is just the bags, and that's kind of what we're sculpting in now. So we're sculpting little detail that we're going to emphasize later, but we're also kind of filling in the sockets of the eyes and trying to make sure everything looks good together with the eyeballs in place now. With the eyeball in place. We'll be getting the other eyeball here in a second. So that looks pretty good. Let's do some more minor adjustment with the move tool. And make sure the eyes are a little more in place. And pull these back just a little bit because you don't want the slope to stick out too far. I believe it is called the Lacrimal Bone where that area lies, and it does matter kind of how it's implemented. Again, it's one of the first things people will read when they look at a humanoid piece. And just redefine the brow line a little bit. We're not going to go too crazy with it. We just want to make sure it's evident. So and now what we can go ahead and do is we can duplicate the eyeball. So just go down here to duplicate. We got two in the scene now. And now we're going to use a little thing called Subtool Master. After we go ahead and duplicate this again. We're going to use Subtool Master to duplicate it. So we go up here and we go to Z plugins and we go to Subtool Master down here and open it up, and you see it has the button there. It's underneath the plugs menu, so just make sure you go down here and click on Subtool Master, and then you can click on the button. That'll bring up this little menu over here, and what this is going to allow us to do is mirror over the eyeball to the other side. And we only have the one right now, but we're going to take it and we're going to mirror it. So make sure you have it selected over here in your scene and just click on mirror. And make sure we got it selected across the Z-axis. The Z-axis where we mirror it's going to be across this way. So let's click OK, and we have our duplicate eyeball. It should be perfectly in place, and you'll notice right off here too we got both eyeballs in one subtool. So we don't have to worry about messing with them separately or anything like that. They're all one piece now. So I think with that we will go ahead and jump to the next chapter of this. Okay, so you can see here I actually jumped up a subdivision and I sculpted in some newer detail. It's really all I did was just general sculpting in, redefining some of the parts. I did dig in on some of the crevices a little bit to give some of the medium detail. We can continue doing that here too, actually. What I'm doing is really just real basic stuff, and using the pinch brush and the standard brush, and of course the smooth brush, I'm getting a lot of these nice medium details in that are really going to give us a nice foundation for the smaller detail we're going to work in later. And here is where you can really start to give him his trademark features, like his if he has ridges or anything in his head, as an alien with a head of this profile should. You can start to work these things in the medium level of things, and it'll start to come through and look like it'll start to give you a better idea of what the final picture is going to look like. And we do definitely have a lot more polygons to work with now, so you can really work things in that will be seen in the final sculpt. And if you ever find yourself getting too lost in some of the detail, to where you can't, like, you're having a lot of trouble controlling it in a certain spot, you can always dip back on the subdivision levels if you kept them, which is always a good idea to keep them until you get to the Dynamesh and the retopology and stuff. But you can just go ahead and dip back on the subdivision levels, and that way you can move things around a little easier, and you don't really lose any of that detail that you just put in on the higher subdivision. You can see we're going to go ahead and just continue working in little things, but we're also going to really redefine some of these parts, like under the jawline, up here where it kind of extrudes the most. You want to have a really pronounced part there, because this guy is kind of a brute. He's kind of almost like a Thanos type, so he's got to have that strong jawline. It's got to be real evident. Actually, I think his cheekbones are a little bit too high there. Bring those down, and actually let's go ahead and suppress that area a little bit. We want his cheekbones to kind of hook around the eyes rather than all the way up there to the top. Because we still need his eyebrow to overlap there. It's still a little bit blown out over here on the sides. Of course, it is important to look at this from every angle. You look at it from the front, you make sure the silhouette's good. If you see something that's a little undesirable, like kind of like up here, I don't really like that it's sticking out like that, you can jump over to the side and mess around with it and try to get it a little more defined. He's still relatively blobby, even for having organic skin. He's still looking a little bit relatively blobby, but we can just keep going in and redefining things until we get something we like. Actually, at this point too, what I'm going to go ahead and do is break out the, it's the Forms brush, I think is what it's called. Form Soft. This is kind of a modified version of the standard brush, and it's made more for working in skin folds and things like that. Another one of my favorites is the Damien standard brush, and it's called it's actually abbreviated in here. It's the Dam standard brush, and we'll be using that a lot whenever we get into the detail of this, because it really helps with getting the crevices and things like that in. But since we're still working in medium details, we'll continue to do that with this brush. Ours, the intensity is pretty low on that one. Let's bring it up so we can really define these crevices. And one pretty cool thing, if you want a little trick about anatomy here, is I think I learned this one from one of Ryan Kingsland's videos. He's a great sculpturist and very great ZBrush guy to learn from. And one of his little anatomy tricks was the let's see if I remember what the name is. It's like the puppet mouth, or the puppeteer mouth, or something like that. And what he's referring to is how the jawline, if you've seen any kind of cartoonish things or anything like that, where the jawline comes down all the way, and you notice right away that defined line right there. Well, you don't want to go down all the way, but having that little feature defined is something that really pops out, and it gives a lot of nice expression to the character. At this point, we can't do it too much, but we can make sure that it's evident. And we'll use the pinch brush here, actually, to give a little more definition to that part. And cut in some nice folds a little more too. Let's come down here and give him his Adam's apple back that we took away. Okay, so we're just going to speed this forward, and I'll be adding in some more details up here, I think, and see if I can't bring him to a point to where we can start using the Dynamesh feature and retopologize him so we can finish up working the medium detail on the ears and other parts that are stretched out, like down here on the traps. And we'll take them up to the next subdiv from there and start working in that smaller detail. We'll get the beginnings of that, and we'll take them to the finish on the sculpt side. Alright, so now we can actually jump into the fun part here, actually. We're going to take him up another subdivision level. And we had gotten him to a point where he's starting to come together actually a lot better. So we're just going to continue refining, and hopefully we'll get something a lot more defined from this subdivision, because it's this this subdivision level we're sitting at about 71,000 polygons right now. So you're going to start to see more detail pop in. And this is where we're going to get the we're going to bridge the gap between the small and the medium detail. And one thing I like to do starting out when I'm doing the small to medium detail is I kind of just like to cut in, you know, almost like a knife, just really slice in this detail. Because what you're going to end up doing anyway, or at least what I do, is I go back and I refine it. And I refine it over and over again until I get it right. But I cut it in first, so that's real pronounced and real definitive. And I do that all over the mesh before I refine it and make it look a little more subtle, a little more practical. It's just a particular thing that I do. I don't know if every artist does this, but you can really get the bags under the eyes going with this too. And of course, we really cut in the eyebrows and really give them that mean expression, you know, because most aliens are evil overlords, and they don't like other people very much. So that's going to be this guy. And here we can kind of cut down on the blobbiness of the eyebrow. We want him to have a nice strong eyebrow, but avoid that blobbiness. And definitely make sure the overlap is evident. The all-important overlap. It gives a lot of pronunciation to it. And we'll cut in that top of the eyelid here. And we are getting a little bit of blobbiness. It's going to happen at this higher subdivision. It does happen. It's just kind of the way things work. Actually, a good way to avoid doing that is to have your lazy mouse turned on. And if you go up here to, let's see if I remember where it is, to stroke, actually, yes. You go stroke and you go to lazy mouse. And ZBrush 4R4, it's turned on by default. And so what that's going to, it's turned on by default. And lazy mouse is basically going to give you an even stroke. If you haven't learned that yet, you should have learned that in the ZBrush Basic series. And it does help out quite a bit. But by default, the lazy radius, which is how far the brush drags before the lazy mouse kicks in, it's set to 1, which is really low, and it's not going to help out much with the even of the stroke. So we're going to crank that up quite a bit. And now we can work with a little more even stroke, and that will give us a little more control over the blobbiness, so that we don't run into that problem as much. And we'll go ahead and use the pinch tool here. And we'll pinch this in because as the brow line closes in the middle, the skin folds do come closer together if he has an expression, like a mean expression or something, and this guy definitely does. So bring that down. And make sure it's very pronounced. And we'll go ahead and move his eyes a little bit inward. And we'll go ahead and break out the polish tool to give us a little flatter look on the eyebrows. Kind of give this guy a little more stylized look, even though we're going for semi-realistic, I guess, if you want to call it that. And then we'll jump back to our standard brush and continue to refine. And so again, just like I said, working in the large forms, you're just going over the same detail. You're just kind of going over it again and again, the trial and error of it, trying to pull everything together and give it a tight look. And so it's just constant revision. Like I said, it's just constant revision and going over things several times. You'll notice we haven't worked on the ears yet, and might be a good time to start doing that now. So we'll actually take the standard brush again, and we will dig in right above the ear here. Dig in a nice cut and really bring out the shape of the ear. And don't worry about the blobbiness. You can always use the smooth tool to go back over that. We'll cut on the inside of the ear here and give him a little bit more shape to this instead of just a big blob sticking out the side of his head. Now the human ear actually has a very complex shape to it. If you don't know it right off, it is a little hard to understand at first, but it almost acts like a spiral. But we're just going to go ahead and dig that right in there, and it will at least look decent. We definitely don't want it sticking out that far, so we'll take the move tool and kind of just nudge it back in that way. And really dig in there. Make sure that it looks like it overlaps from the front and relatively from the side. And so again, we'll just continue to redefine that using those same principles. Revise, 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 and we'll work in a lot of the nice small detail, and we'll move forward from there. So I'll start a little time lapse now, and you'll see it work all in, and then we'll continue forward. Alright, so now that we've gone ahead and done quite a bit to the detail for this subdivision level, actually, obviously you can see by the meshiness, he still is at a rather low subdivision level, and if we check the geometry menu, we're only up to 5 subdivision levels and 71,000 polygons, which is still relatively low. Even for a bust, that's still relatively low. So what we're going to do actually is we are going to jump them up one more and continue to work on the smaller detail. But as we work on the smaller detail, we're going to try to keep all these large forms intact. That's a very important thing actually to keep in mind, because you don't want to be going into your smaller detail and pulling all these forms out and kind of just making it look a lot blobby or anything like that. You want it to look clean all the way around. You want the silhouette to stay clean. Nice clean lines here and not just a bunch of bumps and stuff. So that's pretty important to remember actually whenever you're putting in the small detail. But we're going to continue using the method we used before. You can see I did some other things, like I added little lines to his lips, and I dug in a little more on the brow line and on the cheeks. But again, we're going to move in with the smaller detail, and we're going to try to make them pop a lot more. So we're just going to jump up one more subdivision level, and you can see the mesh is pretty much almost completely disappeared now, except for the ears, because of the way the topology is there right now. So don't worry too much about that right now. We're just going to worry about the focal point being the face. And it looks like I did get a little line problem up here. Sometimes when you're using lazy mouse and you're sculpting along, the cursor might jump sometimes. That's just a problem within Zbrush, and it's still pretty easy to fix. You can either just undo it as soon as you do it, or you can just go back and smooth over it real lightly, and that way you don't have to worry too much about losing any detail you already had. It happens, just a software thing. So anyway, now that we got him up another subdivision level, we're going to go ahead and jump in, and we're going to dig in even more some of these details. Most of the time when you go up another subdivision level, you're going to lose a little bit of the detail because it's smoothing out the polygons, and it's kind of just giving everything a little bit more subtle look as you move up more, and the mesh itself becomes smoother. So we're going to have to refine a little bit more on what we had just done, and we're going to dig in with some new details. So I think first I'll start up here with the brow line and the forehead. And what I'll do is I will take the Dynamesh standard brush, which is, like I said, one of my favorite brushes, and we'll set it at something relatively low, like 10, which might even still be too high. I think that might still be too high. We'll go down to 8. And we'll bring the brush size up a little bit. And we'll just start to go ahead and refine those same things we just did. Of course, at the same time we're refining, we are kind of sort of adding some new detail in. Nothing drastic, but we're making sure that all this new detail flows in with the old detail. That's a very important thing too. Let's go ahead and crank it back up to like 12, because I think we're having to overstroke this a few times more than we should. Eventually, once you get to a high enough subdivision level and you're making some really fine changes to the detail, jumping up any more after that probably won't lose you too much detail, if any, because the higher subdivision levels will be filling in all these gaps with a lot of different polygons. So it won't be so spaced out there as far as the polygon count goes. You'll have a lot of polygons in one spot regardless, because everything, like I said, everything divides exponentially. So you'll have lots of polygons in these small crevices with each subdivision, obviously, and because of that you won't have to worry too much about losing any detail from stepping up another subdivision. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're jumping up subdivision levels. The gist of it, the idea being, is that your lower subdivision levels are going to be primarily used for changing the large forms in the detail if you have to jump back. And as I said, even while you're down here, you want to keep refining, or you can create new detail. It's not really harming anybody. Of course, at this point, I think the lips are still a little bit too stretched out to handle fine detail. So we might just do a little additional striations to his lips. Yeah, if we go up a little higher, then we really are going for that Thanos look. Sure, why not? Makes him look interesting. And it doesn't hurt to exaggerate on a guy like this either, since he's kind of got the alien thing going. As I said, like before with the human anatomy thing, you don't necessarily need to make him look completely accurate anatomy-wise. It certainly helps to be practical, but you can definitely exaggerate on a lot of things and still have him read like the character he's supposed to. And especially with the skin folds too, you usually want those to tuck behind whatever, like for instance with the eyelids, you're going to want them to tuck behind the eyebrow, obviously. And it does look like we have it sticking out a little bit too far here, so we're just going to go ahead and use the move tool to bring it in. You know what, actually, I almost didn't even notice. He kind of has a Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa look to him. The expression and all that. And if you guys don't know who that is, that would be the original Shang Tsung and the Mortal Kombat movie. And he's actually also going to be in the new series out here, reprising his role, so that's really cool. But maybe I'm just crazy. But he does kind of have that expression to him and that demeanor. So I find it kind of interesting. Plus I'm trying to entertain you while I am sculpting him. Because, again, like I'm doing, it's just revision. It's revision and addition. I guess one good tip too would be when you're adding in new details, the rule of thumb really is to just kind of use the contour of the shape of the head or the whatever. If you're sculpting a whole body or anything like that, just use the contour of how everything flows together. And there are a lot of contour lines that run through the human body, wherein everything's kind of really attached to each other in this really smooth and planned out way, I guess. But if you keep an eye on the contour when you're drawing in new details, like you can see right here how I'm kind of subconsciously doing it anyway. I'm following this line around down this line here. I'm not just like drawing it across. I'm not drawing it down the middle or anything like that, even though I could draw it down the middle and still be technically adhering to my rule. Contour is very important because it brings the details that you're going to put in, and it puts them in this flow that works with the rest of the piece. And if you work with the contour instead of just placing random details, it's going to come out looking a lot more well-rounded and a lot more polished. Because if you put in just a bunch of random detail, it's going to end up looking really noisy and really messy. And I've seen that mistake made far too many times. It's honestly not a hard thing to avoid. I've especially seen some really bad normal maps before that. Just, they look like they cranked the noise filter in Photoshop up to whatever its maximum level is and just let it rip about 5 times. It gets pretty bad, some of the stuff. But again, it's not a hard thing to avoid, so it looks like we got another little bit overlap with the eyelid there. We might be able to run the smooth tool over his eyelids because they do look a little bit blobby. At the least, this will even things out a little bit. And then we can take that damn standard brush and cut right back into it. Nice clean stroke and not have to worry about the blobbiness. Alright, so I think what I'll go ahead and do is run another time lapse, and you'll get to see some of the smaller detail being worked in, at least the final smaller detail, before we jump into alphas, which will be the next part of this. We'll be using alpha stamps, whatever you want to call them, brushes, overlays. We will be using those to create the really fine detail on his skin, and that'll be coming right up next. Alright, so now we can go ahead and actually get in with those really small details, but because we're going to jump them up another subdivision level here. Oop, you see he's at 286,000 polygons right now. We'll be jumping him up another subdivision level, but first, before we do that, because we're going to be doing the small details, we're going to want the topology on this guy to be a little more in sync with what we're trying to do, because we did add a lot of new parts later with pulling the ear out and stuff like that, and that can be a little bit of a problem when you're trying to fit in some small detail in this area right here. You can see, I mean, we're only going to do this at the current subdiv level. Actually, you know what, just for example, let's jump up another subdiv level. You see now we're even at we're at 1,014,000, 1,146,000, I can't count. And even now the ear, because it was all stretched out when we pulled it out anyway, it's all very low resolution here, so any detail we try to fit in here, even at this high polygon level, is going to cause issues. You can see the faceting, and it's just not going to look good at all, and it sticks out like a sore thumb in comparison to the rest of this. So in order to take care of that, we're going to use a tool in Zbrush called Dynamesh. And Dynamesh debuted with 4R2, I believe. But what Dynamesh essentially does is it retopologizes your model for you. And if we turn on the frame down here, polyframe, you'll see this is kind of a representation of how the faces are spread out on the model. It's certainly not just these faces right here drawn on the outside. They're a lot smaller because we are up at a pretty high count right now, but this is a representation, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. Wherein the faces over here they're kind of spread out evenly in a way. You can see the elongation here, and it gets really bad in the inner ear part of there because they're all stretched around. So what we're going to do, turn polyframe off, we're going to zoom back out on this guy here. So what we're going to do actually is create a duplicate of him first. Right here in the subtool menu, click duplicate while you have that model selected, and then we're going to go down here to our geometry menu, and we're going to open up Dynamesh. Now, usually it'll look like this, at least in 4R4 it will. Otherwise in 4R2 and 3 I believe it's already open by default. But we're going to open that up, and before we do anything, your resolution should be set to 128 by default, I believe. But that's not going to be enough for this guy. We're already at a pretty high count on polygons, so we need them to be higher resolution, so we can retopologize that mesh in a way to where we can reproject all that detail. And what we're going to do is turn that up to about 352, I think. 352 should be good enough. Hopefully it won't be too much, but we're going to also crank the blur up to about 15. And what that's going to do is, when you retopologize them, all these little cracks and crevices, if you do it without blur, you're going to possibly get some artifacting here that you might not really want. And so what blur does is it smooths everything out. Now it does smooth everything on the model, so we will lose some detail, but that's the whole point of reprojecting it, so we can get all that detail back. And so we'll also turn on clay polish, which will also give us a clean topology with the clean look with the topology. And we'll turn on the reprojected Dynamesh, and that does some of the projecting for us from the old head onto the new head. So we got ours selected here. Make sure you have that duplicate selected and not the original. And then what we'll go ahead and do is just click Dynamesh right here, and it'll ask you about the multiple subdivision levels. I think at this point we're not going to be jumping back, we're just going to be adding that fine detail and going forward, so we're just going to click no, and it'll delete all the old subdivision levels. Because if you leave them on, you got to remember too, it's going to eat up your RAM, because it has to keep them in the memory. So we're just going to avoid that. And you see our subdivision levels are gone. We'll go ahead and turn off Dynamesh, and we're going to go up here, and we have our Dynamesh retopologized head on the top here, and you can see all that noticeable loss of detail because the smooth command and the polish. And the polish actually gives it this kind of clay look to it. But we're going to go ahead and reproject onto our lower head so we can get all that detail we worked in right back. And of course, if you just switch between the two, you can see the detail pop in and out. So we want all our detail back, and so all we're going to do is make sure that the original head that we had created is visible, and make sure we have the Dynamesh head selected though, and you'll know it's selected by the gray kind of tab here. Otherwise, if it looks like this, even though this head might be visible, you won't have this one. You'll have this one selected. It'll be projecting the wrong mesh. So just make sure you have that selected, make sure the other one is visible, and we're going to crank our distance all the way up to 1, because the distance is basically how far it reads out from its original faces. So just crank that up to 1. I don't think we're going to have to worry too much about it, but after you do all that, go ahead and click Project All. It'll project on the other mesh, and it'll bring in all that detail to the new mesh. Now you can see we turn off our old mesh. This is our Dynamesh head. Now you might be going, what the hell? You know, this the ear was the main idea of doing Dynamesh to retopologize. Well, if you look at our old mesh, we have very faceted faces there anyway. Using project, that basically projects on everything, including those faceted faces. So that's going to happen with your Dynamesh, but the difference is if you try to smooth your old mesh, you're still going to have very faceted faces. It's not going to look good. If you smooth the new mesh, then it actually looks smooth because the topology is completely different. So, and if you're not familiar with topology is just basically the flow in which the faces move around the entire model or sculpt or anything. And to get a further look at that again, this is our new topology. This is our old topology. Now again, don't pay attention to the fact that these are really large faces that have been out of shape. We're going much smaller with this. And all these polygons right here. And if you look at the new mesh, tons of little polygons, but they're all evened out. This is an even surface now. So we can use this to continue to sculpt on. Alright, so now that we got that, we turn our eyes back on. And we will go ahead and sculpt on this guy, and then we'll subdivide him and work in that really high detail. And next we'll go ahead and move into things like alphas that'll really help to pop a small detail a lot better.